Salam alaikum, I'm Arrindell and you're watching In Focus. At the end of last week, International Development Secretary Justine Greening announced an additional £87 million from the UK's Syria aid response budget to be allocated to the UN's World Food Programme. To discuss the implications, I'm pleased to be joined today by the Right Hon Alan Duncan, Minister of State for International Development, who's been at the forefront of implementing the UK's humanitarian policy in the region. Salam alaikum, Alan, and welcome to In Focus.
Thank you.
Now, I understand that the new allocation brings the total UK funding in Syria to over £150 million, part of an overall budget of £500 million, which the UK has ring-fenced for Syria. How significant is this additional distribution of support at this time directly to the WFP, and will it have any effect on the level of support to other partners on the ground in the region?
Well, as you say, Britain is giving £500 million for the Syrian crisis, and this is the largest amount we have ever given to a humanitarian crisis. And within that, yes, we've just announced a further £87 million, particularly for the World Food Programme, because what we have to do when we pledge this money is to allocate it through the best possible channels for helping the people who need that sort of help, both inside Syria and outside. And within and outside Syria, people need food. And the WFP is a very good partner for delivering what we think are the top priorities for humanitarian aid.
Now, bearing in mind that the stated weekly requirement from the WFP is £18 million in order to meet the food needs of people affected by the Syrian conflict, and taking into account the Secretary of State Justine Greening's recent statement, and I quote, "Maybe the countries that do not favour military strikes need to now ask themselves whether they can contribute more to the humanitarian effort." Is the rest of the international community following properly Britain's lead in this? Have they stepped up meaningfully to the plate?
You're right. I mean, I think we are giving a lead here, and we do need other countries to pledge money on the sort of scale that we have pledged it. I reckon that the Syrian crisis requires about $1 billion a month from the world community in order to help people who are in need. We have been extraordinarily generous, and so we want other countries to match or do what they can. And the trouble is with this, it's not like an earthquake or something where you can give the money and then by and large you've solved the problem. This is going to go on and on. And the United Nations appeal is short of a couple of $1 billion or more, depending on how much that was pledged at the United Nations General Assembly week will convert into hard cash. And when we start next year, there will be a continuing need for Syria. So until such time as we get a de-escalation of conflict and some sort of progress towards a political settlement, which is the only way of stopping this, there is going to be a continuing demand. So we need other countries from all over the world to realise the scale of what is needed.
The recent Bongo Land row, which grabbed the headlines a few weeks ago on the issue of whether it is appropriate for us during times of austerity to continue to fund international aid at our current level. What, in your understanding, are the compelling reasons for a continued ring-fencing of international aid? Do you think you enjoy popular support for this? And should security issues and the countering of terrorist threats remain key in your decision of deployment, especially in the region of Syria?
We're very proud to be the first major Western country to hit 0.7% of national income to be spent on international development. But within that budget is this amazingly significant pressing need in and around Syria. And actually, if you discuss the issue of aid with the great British public, at first they'll say, well, why are we giving all this money to Africa when we've got pressures here at home? But if you say to them, what about Syria? They say, oh yeah, you ought to be spending it there. Because they can see that it is necessary. They know that also it's a little bit closer to home, not so far away from where they might think of going on holiday, for instance. And so there's a lot of understanding about the need. And actually, we have to keep up awareness of this need. So we need people like you to keep the pictures on television so that the public, not just in the UK, but in all other countries as well, can appreciate that they are right to be giving money to people who need help.
Now, at a fringe meeting at the annual Conservative Party conference this last weekend, you were reported as saying that the consequences of the failed parliamentary debate, that's the best way to describe it, on military action resulted, as you put it, in a serendipitous result. The suggestion I think you were hinting at is that there'd been a surprise positive arising from a negative. Can you explain what you meant?
Serendipity means a lucky accident. And no one, I think, when we were looking at how to react to the use of chemical weapons, could quite have predicted what has unfolded since. And my point was that I think that, although it would have been perfectly justified, I think, to react to the use of chemical weapons, what has since unfolded has got some helpful elements in it. The involvement of the Russians, I think, is leading to the dismantling of chemical weapons, which can only be a good thing, and that does seem to be proceeding, but we'll watch it very carefully. The involvement of the Russians might also, I hope, improve humanitarian access, because we can pledge as much money as we're prepared to, but if we can't get the food and the clothing and the shelter to people who need it, it doesn't really do any good. So we need the access, and everyone should grant unhindered humanitarian access. And the third point is that the only way we're going to solve the Syrian crisis is really through political means. And perhaps, again, with the Russians involved, there's a chance of what they call Geneva II, which is the second round of talks in Geneva following the ones last year. And if it can lead to some kind of talks involving as many parties as possible who are willing to help, then we're in with a chance, I hope, of seeing an end to this horrible, long-standing conflict.
The UK government has been clear up until now that a future Syria cannot be contemplated with Bashar Assad still in power. It is fair to assume that events have now made it possible, even likely, that the government will have to modify its position in this respect. What do you think that will mean in terms of support that the Foreign Secretary, for example, only just last week pledged to the Syrian national opposition, described by William Hague as the sole legitimate representatives of the Syrian people?
Well, I think that they certainly have more legitimacy than Bashar al-Assad, who's gassing, or has done, and at the very least bashing his own people. And that's no way for any leader to behave. So we will need people to sit around the table. I find it very difficult to contemplate a Syria with a President Assad at its head. But in the end, this has to emanate from Syria itself and from Syrians. And I hope in due course we will see people sitting around the table.
You don't think that the language is going to suddenly start to change in terms of the way we relate not only to the opposition but also to Assad?
I don't think that's necessarily the right question, because I think the real point is that there are no easy answers here. And anyone can sit in judgment, and if you just sit in judgment in a simplistic way, you are applying simplistic judgments to a very complicated issue. And we have to appreciate and understand the complexities here and not be drawn into any kind of sort of supposedly easy answers, because it's not easy.
Few will have failed to have been horrified by the footage of the victims of the chemical attacks in Syria on the 21st of August. I'm aware that the UK in response directly provided a package of chemical weapons protective equipment, including 5,000 escape hoods, which were delivered to the Syrian opposition. Given the more significant involvement, as you put it, of Russia, do you regard further spending in this area may be less of a priority going forward?
Well, if there are no chemical weapons, I'd like to think it would not be necessary at all. But certainly I think the main priority is to help those in immediate and desperate need, and that's why we have such an enormous humanitarian effort, something we'd like other countries to replicate. And we, of course, will be feeding people through the World Food Programme, educating people through UNICEF, and working through the Red Crescent and Save the Children, and anyone who we hope and think can be useful.
Now, despite the apparent breakthroughs in chemical weapons disarmament, ongoing fighting continues across the country, including clashes between anti-regime factions. This has hindered the flow of humanitarian support in the region. Aid agencies also complain that the Syrian government has hindered access to visas and tried to limit the number of foreign groups operating in the country. The UN Security Council has demanded just this week, in the wake of the new understandings, and immediate access to aid. Are you optimistic that delivery will now be stepped up?
I'm not as optimistic as I'd like to be, but I hope there will be improvements, and the point of your question is absolutely valid, which is that when all that's happening is for one set of human beings to try and help another set of human beings who are in desperate need, no one should hinder that access. If it's to give people food and medicines and clothing and shelter, then that should happen regardless of who is fighting whom for different reasons. So that unhindered, unimpeded humanitarian access is an absolute demand from us, and no decent person should get in the way of it.
UK's charity regulating body, the Charity Commission, made a statement last week warning that people giving money to help millions of refugees from the civil war in Syria are inadvertently supporting terrorism. I'm quoting them. Even the Disasters Emergency Committee, which represents 14 of Britain's biggest charities and which has raised an estimated £20 million since the launch of the Syria crisis appeal in March, whose members include Islamic Relief, British Red Cross, Oxfam and Save the Children, have said that they are unable to guarantee that no cash was falling into the hands of terrorists. Now, whilst I gather that the Charity Commission has issued guidance to fundraising bodies, I imagine that many will be worried that the best intentions of the many charitable bodies, especially Muslim-based NGOs, which I can tell you have raised millions of pounds during the recent holy month of Ramadan, may place them on the wrong side of anti-terrorist and money laundering control bodies. Millions of pounds each week were raised on the Islam Channel alone during this period. Can you give donors and NGOs any advice and reassurance?
I've got some very simple advice. Do not stop giving. And the head of the Charity Commission, who is the regulatory body for the UK, has clarified what he thought were slightly distorted comments in a Sunday newspaper. And he said, you should continue giving. And he said, of course, we'll always be on the lookout for the dangerous diversion of any money. But if you are giving to reputable organisations who are adhering to the highest possible standards in the most difficult of circumstances, then that, I think, should make you feel sufficiently reassured to continue to give.
300 people are found dead after a boat with up to 500 African asylum seekers caught fire and sank off the Italian shores in what has been described as the worst disaster in recent history off the remote island of Lampedusa in the Mediterranean. Victims included large numbers of women and children understood to have originated from Eritrea, Libya, Somalia and Syria. Now, the Italian Prime Minister declared a day of mourning, and the Interior Minister, Angelino Alfano, called for more assistance from the European Union to deal with the sharp increase in refugee arrivals, calling it a European tragedy. Now, is there a need for the European Union, in your opinion, to revise its migrant policy?
I think that what's much more important is that organisations such as the one I'm a minister in, DFID, and governments all over the world do their best to help other countries so that by reducing the risk of and the incidence of conflict, people won't feel the need to flee. And the more peaceful a country, the fewer displaced people or immigrants there are likely to be. So I think our focus should be on trying to keep countries themselves stable so that their natural citizens don't feel they want to move somewhere else.
The UK has a proud history of providing safe haven for the desperate fleeing from conflict and persecution. Now, I've read reports of dozens of Syrian migrants, including professionals such as doctors and engineers, who have fled the conflict but being denied asylum access via Calais to the UK. Tensions in that port have apparently reached a peak, with some asylum seekers threatening to commit suicide by jumping off buildings in the area if access continues to be denied. Now, are you aware of this crisis, and do you think Britain, as well as other European countries, should revise its border controls at this time of enhanced humanitarian need?
I think that our welcome, as you say, historically has always been very generous. And in this case, our main focus is on trying to take much needed help to them and that's what we will continue to be. But in terms of any shift in immigration policy or numbers, that's a Home Office matter, which you will appreciate is a matter for the Home Secretary.
The Right Honourable Alan Duncan, MP, Minister of State for International Development, thank you very much for joining us on Islam Channel.
Thank you.
Thank you.